Welcome everyone to the fourth episode of our series of events on Jewish medical ethics. 3 months ago, we heard of the first successful transplant of a pig's kidney into a human being. This was a tremendous feat, as the issue of rejection of such tissue has been an insurmountable challenge in the past. And it opens up a huge area of possibility in the world of transplantation. But as good Jews, we cannot help but ask, is it kosher? Not that we'd be eating the said pig, but the whole issue of cross-species transplantation opens up a range of other halachic challenges. Remember the ear growing on the back of the mouse in the first session in our series. And in Germany, currently genetically modified pigs are being cloned, ready for use in transplantation. So the question is this the answer to chronic shortage of human organs available? Will it save the lives of the thousands who die annually because of lack of organs? Or are we exploiting animals for our own benefit? Are we exploiting human beings by taking their organs for transplant? Should we rather be looking at the development of technology to artificial organs or improvements in machines such as dialysis? How successful is this field of research? We've come a long way since the first successful kidney transplant in 1950 and the first heart transplant in 1967, but we still have a long way to go. So to discuss these issues tonight, we have with us Professor Anthony Warrens, the Dean for Education and Director of the Institute of Health Sciences, Education at Barts and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry. He is a practicing consultant renal physician with a particular interest in transplantation medicine, and in particular a concern with the ideas of the issue of rejection. He's also, having worked with basically a multicultural community in this research, has looked at trying to understand the impediments to organ donation to be found in various cultures, of which, of course, Judaism is one. And as a former chair of the London School of Jewish Studies, he's well placed for this study. We'd hoped also tonight to be joined by Dr. Graham Lipkin. He may also be able to join us later. He's a specialist in renal medicine for well over 20 years, has been the clinical director of renal medicine at the University Hospital of Birmingham Foundation NHS Trust. Unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he's in Costa Rica, and we're not entirely sure how good his internet is. He does want to join us, but he may not be able to do so. So we'll start anyway with Professor Warrens and see how we go. Over to you, Professor.
Rabbi Sheridan, thank you very much indeed for the invitation and for your kind words. And I'm sure I speak for myself and Graham Lipkin that we're delighted to have the opportunity to have this conversation. He and I have had a couple of chats in advance. We know each other reasonably well. So hopefully I speak for both of us. And if he is able to join us later on, I'm sure he will add a lot to the discussion. Let me first of all try and share what I wanted to show you by way of a talk. Is that showing, Rabbi Sheridan?
It is. No, it isn't at the moment. Now we can see it.
Now you can see it.
Yes.
Good. So all that matters is for me to see what I'm showing you, which I did a minute ago.
You go up to slideshow at the top.
Okay, are we in business?
Yes, indeed we are.
Fantastic, fantastic. So just to outline what I'm going to be saying over the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the value of transplantation, the Jewish position in principle, the shortages of organs, and then the challenges in Jewish law. And I'll towards the end talk about some of the very interesting issues that Rabbi Sheridan brought up in her introduction. The first recorded transplant, this is a picture not often shown in a Jewish meeting, is undertaken in, I think it's the 2nd century by St. Cosmas and St. Damian. And what I love about this is the absolute optimism that this leg transplant is going to be so successful that it's entirely appropriate to have a pair of sandals by the bed so that the chap will get out of bed and walk away. This was never verified, of course, and it was until in the 1950s that the first modern renal transplant took place. And this is a fantastic picture that is in the Countway Library in the School of Public Health in Boston, which is 2 operations going on: the donor kidney nephrectomy and the transplant into to this particular recipient, in which all the individuals who were involved in the science as well as the surgery are brought together. The donor and recipient were Ronald and Richard Herrick, shown here on the left, and this is them 10 months after transplantation. And I show this to make a number of points. Number one, first of all, that Richards did very well as a recipient. He lived for another 8 years, very happy 8 years. He ended up marrying the nurse who nursed him through the transplant. And Ronald, the donor, also led a very healthy life. And on the picture on the right, you see Ronald Herrick in 2004, the 50th anniversary of this donation. In fact, he looks rather more healthy than Joe Murray, who was the surgeon who did the operation and who got a Nobel Prize for doing this. But it's an anecdotal way of demonstrating to you how safe being a kidney donor can be. Heart transplantation got off to a more rocky start, shall we say, in the late 60s by a rather flamboyant man many of you will remember, called Christian Barnard. Louis Washansky was the first man to receive it, and he only lived 18 days. Philip Bleiberg lasted a lot longer, but unfortunately the success rate was relatively low. And this gave rise to serious ethical doubts about the appropriateness of it. And in his Ikrot Moshe, probably the greatest Orthodox posek of the 20th century, Rav Moshe Feinstein, said that heart transplant is not allowed because it's a murder of the donor and it's murder of the recipient, since that success rate is so poor. And that's something that heart transplant has had to live down. But live down it has done. Because here is the outcomes of long-term patient survival following heart transplantation. And you can see that in this particular cohort, and this is a large number of patients for out to 10 years, the patient survival is 70%. And it's even better for a long-term kidney transplant. The 10-year survival, this is 2,000 plus patients, is out at 80%. 70% for livers. And so it's generally true to say that this is now a safe procedure. What are the benefits of kidney transplantation? And I'll stick with kidneys because that's what I know most about. Well, if your kidneys don't work, that is incompatible with life. And so the alternative is one or other form of renal replacement therapy. And that means replacing function artificially with dialysis or another organ through transplantation. And this is just one study that shows patient survival. And patient survival on dialysis at 10 years is much, much less than patient survival following a transplant. So there is no doubt that transplantation prolongs life expectancy. In very general terms, it doubles life expectancy. But it's not just about life expectancy, about quantity of life, it's about quality of life. And using one study in which quality of life is measured between 0 and 1, a dialysis patient will average 0.41 and a transplant patient 0.74. And so the point is it improves both quality of life and quantity of life. So given this story, why on earth is there even a question that Judaism might not support organ donation? Well, let's focus on deceased donation from somebody whose life has ended. Why is it possible you might not take organs from that person? Well, there is a halacha of nivul hamet. You are not allowed to mutilate a dead body. We're all very familiar that it is Jewish tradition to bury somebody as rapidly as possible. Halanat hamet, the prohibition against the delaying of that burial. And then there's hana'at hamet, the prohibition of deriving any benefit from a body. None of these have any halachic standing when you compare them to pikuach nefesh. Sorry, could you just hold on? Sorry, pikuach nefesh, which is the sorry, I just want to join. My wife has just walked in.
I just want to join the talk.
Pikuach nefesh, there are only three things that allow you to, you must permit yourself to be killed or somebody to be killed rather than transgressing them. And none of these is, none of nivul hamet, halanat hamet, or hanat hamet, none of them falls into that category. So pikuach nefesh trumps them all. The one thing that is a problem when it comes to Judaism supporting organ donation is the definition of death, because clearly it's not possible, it's completely unacceptable to kill somebody in order to take an organ to save somebody else's life. And so you have to be 100% sure that somebody is dead. And this was the problem that worried Moshe Feinstein when he talked about it being double murder. So let's park that for the moment. Generally, there is a view that you have to do something to save someone's life. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, don't stand idly by when somebody is unwell. It's a very rough translation of that partial pasuk from Vayikra. Liver transplantation is life-preserving. Heart transplantation is life-preserving. Lung transplantation is the same. And kidney, as we've already demonstrated, is life-prolonging. And so therefore, there's a permission to transplant, and indeed you mustn't hold back from it. All the issues are covered within the halachic parameters of pikuach nefesh. It supersedes nivul hamet, hananat hamet, and hana'at hamet. There are a number of other things that are baseless considerations that people come up with. The evil eye, don't talk about what you're going to do after your death because you'll get the ayin hara. All I would say is anybody who has ever signed an life insurance policy didn't seem to be concerned about that. The issue of whether or not it's necessary to have an intact body for the tchiat hametim, the resurrection of the dead. It's not a well-defined or discussed subject within Jewish literature, and I'm not a rabbi, but my understanding is this is, again, completely baseless. And then finally, which is a very practical thing, is the anxiety that if somebody is close to death and there's another patient who might benefit from an organ, that corners will be cut and there might be a premature discontinuation of therapy in order to generate a supply of organs. Now, this is something that we very carefully avoid in our practice of transplantation medicine in this country. We have two separate teams of doctors who look after the donor and the recipient, and the team looking after the donor is entirely focused on the interests of that person. And any suggestion of a blurring of that is completely unacceptable. And so I am satisfied that is not an issue in current transplantation practice in the UK. So we've said that it's a great thing to do. I've also told you that it's halachically acceptable. So then why not offer a transplant to absolutely everyone who could benefit from one? The answer is here. Although things are a little bit better, the line at the top shows the number of people sitting active on the transplant waiting list, waiting for an organ. And the number of transplants performed are in this, the right-hand grayish bar for each year. And although, as I say, the gap has narrowed between these two parameters, it's still a significant gap. And as a result, we know that there are 3 people in the UK who die on the waiting list every day because of the lack of donors. So that's why we don't do enough transplants. I want to just remind you of one other perspective that we've been talking about the patient who might receive an organ. This is Mount Rushmore from looking north in South Dakota on the faces of the 4 then most famous, most revered presidents. Looking south from North Dakota, the picture is less attractive. The perspective is important, and this is the perspective of the recipients. These are 4 young boys, all of whom are transplant recipients, and all of whom participated in the International Transplant Games. You can see that they're looking pretty healthy, and indeed they are looking towards normal lifespans by and large. The other side of that is summarized here. At every American Transplant Congress that I've attended, there has been on display a quilt from each transplant network. And when somebody becomes a donor, their family is invited to provide a square to be put into this quilt to mark the fact that they had made this, this donation. And it's a very moving perspective that behind every one of these success stories, there's a very sad story of somebody whose life was cut short. So that brings us to focus more on the question of where do donated organs come from. I've talked a bit about the deceased donor, and I will talk about the living donor. But I want to get a little bit technical for a minute. This is a summary of the central nervous system, and the central part of the brain is connected to the spinal cord by the brainstem. And this is the part of the body that is responsible for some very primitive, basic functions, of which the most important for our purposes is breathing. When somebody is described as brainstem dead, it's usually as a result of a massive trauma to the head or bleed into the brain. In order to define someone as brainstem death, you have to be able to demonstrate an irremediable structural damage to the brain of known cause, and to demonstrate over a period of time a lack of brainstem function. And the 2 most important here are absent consciousness and no spontaneous breathing. I can say absolutely categorically that if people meet these criteria, there is no prospect of recovery. If the brainstem death tests have been performed well, appropriately, and they're not that difficult, then it is known that this person will not recover. And the advantage is that although the person is dead, the heart and lungs still work, but only while they're on the life support machine. There is no spontaneous breathing. And that means the organs are transplanted in good condition. Brainstem death is a very particular type of coma. It's very different, for example, from persistent vegetative state. And we do know that people sometimes wake up from persistent vegetative state. And so it's very important to make sure that people understand that that is different to brainstem death, which is totally irremediable. So this comes to the area, takes us to the piece of Jewish law that is the principal area of contentiousness, and that is the definition of death. I've already said that if somebody is not yet dead, you clearly cannot take their organs for transplantation. And if they are dead, it's a mitzvah to do so, and you are saving somebody's life. So how do you define death? So this is a discussion from Masechet Yoma in the Babylonian Talmud. And the story is simply this, that a building collapses on Shabbat, and you don't know who's there. You don't know if there's somebody there. Now, you're not allowed to clear up the rubble from a building on Shabbat, it's B'chalal Shabbat. However, if there is a chance of saving somebody's life, then not only are you allowed to remove the rubble, you're obliged to do that. But you do it until such time as you are satisfied that either there's nobody there or the person that's there is dead. And if they're dead, you're not allowed to remove the rubble. So that brings us to the question, how do you define death? And there's a Braita here, and I'll read the English. It says, when you're clearing the rubble from the victim, up to where does the person's body does not examine to see whether or not he's still alive, ad chotmo, up to his nose, v'yesh omrim, but some say ad libo, up to his heart. So if you're saying you're satisfied that you examine up to the nose, you determine whether or not breathing is existing, there still is breathing, then you accept brainstem death criteria, because that's somebody who no longer breathes spontaneously. If, however, you need to demonstrate that the heart is not functioning, then you don't necessarily accept brainstem death criteria because the heart is still beating. Now, it gets to many, many greater levels of complexity, but that essentially is the problem. And if you accept the definition of death as a lack of breathing, then you can accept the removal of organs from somebody who is brainstem dead. If you want the heart to stop, then you can't. It's as simple as that. Now, several major poskim, rabbis of the last couple of generations, Gedolei Hador, support using the sensation of breathing, even if the heart is still beating, and accept that as a definition of death. Others don't. As far back as 1986, the Chief Rabbinate of Israel accepts it. In this country, Chief Rabbi Mervis accepts it. I think it's probably true to say that it is a minority, albeit a very large minority, of Orthodox rabbis who do accept that. And I will leave it for Rabbi Sheridan perhaps to talk about the position of the progressive communities. But that, as I understand it, and as I am not a rabbi, that, as I understand it, is the position of the Orthodox rabbinate. It then throws up the very interesting question, is if you are of the view that it is not acceptable to define death by brainstem death criteria, if you then need an organ yourself, is it acceptable for you to take an organ from someone who has died as a result of meeting those criteria? And that, again, is a very taxing and difficult question that we could discuss later on. But one of the problems we have with getting the sort of numbers of organs that we actually need is that using brainstem death criteria, there just weren't enough. And so we moved towards asking the question, how much worse would outcomes be if we used organs from people whose death was defined following the cessation of heartbeat? And if you take a kidney out very shortly after someone's heart has stopped beating, that would mean that many, many more individuals were available, and it would circumvent the problem of brainstem death. But it's also very demanding in hospital services, and historically, organs like this did not fare as well. That's now become a very common practice, however. So this is a complex slide, and for each of the financial years shown, there are 3 bars. Let's just focus on the first 2 bars of each of the years. And the first bar are the number of donors whose death has been defined by brainstem death criteria. That's in the dark blue. And in the light blue, the second bar, it's a number of donors whose death has been defined using the cessation of circulation. And as you can see, both have gone up. And the number of those whose donation has been after their death has been defined by circulatory criteria has almost doubled. And that's because we have demonstrated that these people do extremely well. And this is the outcome of donation after brainstem death. And the 10-year result here is pretty close to the 80% that we saw previously. And considering what death rate is likely to be on dialysis, that is now regarded as being as good as donation after brainstem death. So what's the Jewish position about circulatory death? Well, it is much easier. The question is, it's not a question, there is a problem that it often gets conflated with the discontinuation of life-sustaining therapy. It is not really practical to have a team of surgeons waiting around for the chance opportunity that unfortunately is not so uncommon of somebody who comes in and whose heart stops. A much more common situation is someone in whom a continuation of therapy is futile and a decision is taken to discontinue life-sustaining therapy. Once that decision is taken, then over a period of time, the heart is likely to stop in a predictable way, and then the organs can be removed after a period of total cessation of circulatory activity. They are two separate events: the decision to discontinue life-sustaining therapy and the donation. However, if they're conflated, you then get into a discussion, which is halachically again challenging, about when is it appropriate and possible to discontinue life-sustaining therapy. It is clear that that is allowed under certain circumstances in halacha, but it's beyond the scope of this talk and indeed of my knowledge to go into it in any greater detail. But there is a significant issue there. There also is a significant issue about whether or not it is permissible to administer drugs to the potential donor in advance of his or her death in order to preserve the organs in a more appropriate fashion. That's not probably necessary, but it is clearly an area of discussion. The second alternative is living donation. And yeah, it used to be a trivial component of the number of organs that were transplanted. When you go back to the century before, so the decade before last, but as long ago as 10 years ago, there were over 1,000 living donors, and the numbers have essentially stabilized since then. And that's the outcome, which you can see is even better. The living donation success rate at about 10 years is about 85%. And we've now got rather more sophisticated in that, sometimes you have, let us say, a husband and wife who wanted to be a donor and recipient and they were found not to be compatible. We now have a national paired and pool scheme whereby the national computer in Bristol will put all the details of the donor and recipient together, and they will say, well, you know, donor and recipient one are not compatible with each other, but donor one is compatible with recipient two, and donor two is compatible with recipient one. And so you can do a paired donation. And in fact, in Baltimore, they have gone as far as having 8 linked pairs in order to maximize the number of transplants. And sometimes these can be pump primed by a so-called altruistic donor. We do about 200 of these a year. When somebody comes in and said, look, I don't have a particular recipient I want to give to, but I know I can happily live life with one kidney. I'd like to help somebody. And so that often primes the sort of a cascade of paired pooled donation that I've described there. And this gives sort of numbers that we've been doing, but I won't go into that because I don't think we've got enough time. Are you allowed to do that Jewishly? Well, again, there is the issue from that Pasuk in Kedoshim, Lo tamod al dam re'echa. You can't stand around where somebody is in need of help. And the general view, and the risks are extremely small. We cite the risk of donor death as 0.03%, which most people believe is an exaggeration, that is rather less than that. And as a result, the majority of Orthodox poskim permit it. It's permissible, but it's not obligatory. So, and again, that is something that I'll leave to Rabbi Sheridan to talk about the views of the progressive community on that. But within the Orthodox community, it is certainly common, and there are actually organizations that attempt to promote it. So coming towards the end now, what can we do to reduce the shortfall? Well, clearly the best thing to do would be to decrease the demand for organs, and we're putting in a lot of effort into preventative medicine and interventions. We're attempting to increase deceased donation and optimize numbers of living donation. I'll pass on that in the interests of time, but there is some degree of variability in donation throughout the country. and the number of people who are actually asked to be donors who could be donors is not as high as it should be. And that means we need to do some ongoing education of our hospital colleagues, but things are much better than they were before. If Graham Lipkin were here, he would talk to you about new technologies. We have developed a very interesting work in hearts, particularly with external hearts pumps, and indeed implantable left ventricular assist devices, which are now so good that it is possible for people who are waiting cardiac transplantation to go home wearing a left ventricular assist device. And whether or not it will ever be so good that there is no need to have an organic heart in place and all you need is this machine that will continually pump, remains to be the case. Much more remains to be seen. Much more experimental or implantable dialysis machines. There are prototypes out there which are half mechanical and half organic. And there are also wearable dialysis machines. One of the problems with dialysis is that if you need to do it, and you do need to do it for about 4 hours, 3 times a week, during each of those occasions, you're attached to a machine. There now have been developed some portable dialysis machines that will allow you to wander around and do things while you dialyze. Again, these are still at the stage of the experimental. Growing organs in the test tube. One of the most amazing presentations I've been to at a medical conference involved a study in which a mouse heart was essentially dissolved in fairy liquid, a detergent. And the detergent removed the cellular material. But as anyone who's eaten meat will know, there is surrounding the cellular material a fibrous framework. And this fibrous framework was then repopulated with mouse stem cells. And after a period of time, it had so reorganized itself into a heart that it began to beat spontaneously. We've not yet got to the stage of being able to do that, but I think the technology will get there. And as long as one can do it with a big enough organ, because the mouse heart is obviously too small, then that's another possibility. And then finally, because it's topical, the use of pig organs. Pigs are the species of choice because they're the mammal that is closest to us that we are best at breeding in numbers. Most primates are rather small. And the pig is, this will come as an upset a lot of people, is remarkably close to us phylogenetically. I should say there is absolutely no halachic issue here. The prohibition is against eating pig. And even if there were a prohibition against implanting it, it would be set aside to save somebody's life. So there is absolutely no question of there being a halachic problem in the Orthodox community with that. And indeed, we've been transplanting pig valves for decades and injecting pig insulin for decades. So there is precedent there. And what people have been doing is attempting to use the pig, genetically manipulated pigs as donors. Why genetically manipulated? Well, using an experimental model, which is essentially transplanting into non-human primates, if you don't manipulate the pig, the life expectancy of a transplanted kidney, let us say, but it's true of a heart, can be measured in minutes. And it will stop working before you've ever sewn up the patient. And this is because of the incompatibility of the immune systems, and therefore the ease with which the human immune system will reject the kidney or the heart. In the genetically manipulated pigs, what they've done is they've altered the targets of the immune system such that the transplanted heart from the pig can evade the immune response. And in animal models, from instant rejection within minutes, that has gone out to a period of 9, 10, 12 months. And that's really quite remarkable. And it's certainly a huge scientific triumph. But of course, you wouldn't do this clinically if it was only going to give a benefit of a small, even a large number of months. But there are ever progressively new manipulations of the pig that have been introduced in order to evade each problem as it becomes a significant issue over a period of time. And so it's probably moved from beyond science fiction to something that it could be done. And it's very interesting that that we've now seen this first case in the US of a transplant of a pig organ. And we're watching it very, very carefully. I think it will be possible. And that will open up a huge, huge number of opportunities for a large number of people who never even get onto waiting lists because we just know we don't have enough hearts or kidneys for them. What are the ethical issues associated with that? Well, I personally, as a non-ethicist, I'm not troubled by it. Are we manipulating animals for our benefit? Yes, and any vegetarian who has a problem with that, I fully respect. But anyone who is happy to go and have a meat meal, I would argue that if you're prepared to cultivate animals in order to eat them, surely it's a higher calling to cultivate them in order to use them to save people's lives. And with respect to the genetic manipulation, there clearly would come a point when there's a too great a degree of humanization, but we're a long, long way away from that. We're talking about tweaking around the edges, which is probably no more problematic than some of the breeding that has been done by dog owners over the centuries to produce ever more attractive species. So I personally am not troubled with it, but I'm very open to hear thoughts about it, and very happy to discuss it further. That last comment about ethics, again, as I've been telling, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not an ethicist, and so I have no greater right to an ethical view than anyone else in the audience. So we've come a long way since this first modern renal transplant in Boston in 1954, and it's been an exciting journey. Tens of thousands of lives have been saved. And since, for example, in kidney transplantation, somebody who has essentially 90% impairment of their fertility on dialysis is converted into somebody with 90% normal fertility. There therefore are a new generation of the children of transplant recipients who would not have existed without this technology. So it's been an exciting time. There are ethical challenges. I think Judaism has risen to many of them. But I will stop here and be very happy to take any questions or comments people have. And so I will stop sharing my screen.
Can we get back into normal mode? Lovely, thank you. Thank you so much. That really is fascinating and indeed so unbelievably challenging. And we have a host of questions already. Can I remind everyone that if you do have a question, can you please put it into the chat? And when, if we have time for your question, we will ask you at that point to unmute and to ask it yourself. I'd actually like to start with Emma. I know you're hiding behind the Lions Learning Project logo, but if you'd like to come on and ask your question, please.
Oh, thank you. So it's just building on the last thing that you were saying about, if you eat meat, then there shouldn't be an issue with using animals to serve humans. I'm a vegetarian, so it really doesn't impact me at all. But I'm just wondering, in terms of, kashrut has this strong idea that you shouldn't cause suffering to an animal when you slaughter it. So I wonder if there is an ethical question around, pigs have evolved in a certain way because it's better for them. And if, as humans, we start manipulating them into being something that's better for us, and it causes them pain in some way, would that still be okay? But that might be outside of your, sphere.
It is outside my area of expertise. I'm certainly, but as I say, we've been what we now have is the technology to introduce genes in a very specific way and very quickly in a single generation. But for centuries, we've been manipulating genes by deliberately breeding animals, and you crossbreed horses in order to get the fastest horse to run around a track faster than anything else. The whole breeding of pigs has been, not that I know very much about it, has been focused on generating the best yield in terms of food. So I guess it's a societal question. I mean, you are right. You can ask the question: should we be using animals to test drugs before giving to people? I mean, many people feel that it's wrong. Other people feel if you can eat them, then it's not unreasonable to try and pick up adverse effects. That's a conversation society has to have and come to a conclusion. I fully understand it and respect your position. I've got my own views, but I don't claim any particular expertise on that.
Okay, thank you. And Emma, now you have to rush quickly into your other role of calling up and spotlighting our next questioner. I know Alex and Christina, one of you have a question. I think it is. Yes, it's Christy, isn't it? If you'd like to.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I learned so much. I have a question about compatibility and the post-transplant immunosuppressant therapy that would be necessary to receive a cross-species organ and not only get through the immediate aftermath of compatibility, but particularly chronic rejection rates. As you can probably tell, I have a family member who underwent a successful Baruch Hashem kidney transplant in 2001. And at that time, as a teenager, I went to Duke Transplant and I got a tour and I wanted my HLAs typed, right? Because I wanted to know if I could be next in line. And this very kind head of Duke Transplant told me, don't worry, in 5 or 10 years, we'll be able to use animal organs. And, chronic rejection won't be an issue because we'll have better options than live donors. So don't worry about it. Now, clearly that was 21 years ago, so things were a little bit more complicated. But so my question is about, how, I'm curious how we establish compatibility, presumably not just ABO and HLA, but also about the sort of long-term implications for the recipient, because as you know, that immunosuppressant therapy can have a huge impact on quality of life. And so if that immunosuppressant therapy had to be at much higher levels, that could not only, impact long-term outcome, but just the quality of life in general.
So it's a very, very insightful question. Of course, we don't know the answer because we've never got to the stage of understanding chronic rejection in xenotransplantation because we haven't got there. We've just been focusing on the acute phase, and although you do begin to see signs of chronic rejection at 10 months, that's as far as we've seen it. We don't normally see much chronic rejection. So this is where I would go back to one of my other interests, my research interests in rejection, and that is the attempt to develop tolerance. Now we know that there is a small number of people, probably 5%, who after a kidney transplant could discontinue all immunosuppressive medication and not reject. They have become tolerant. Their immune system has, for some reason, adapted to the presence of their organ. The problem is we've no idea how we can identify those 5%, and therefore we can't take the risk of removing the drugs that you quite rightly say have got very significant adverse effects. Now, a lot of people have been doing some interesting work in administering bone marrow cells to individuals who are transplant recipients with a view to try and deliberately develop transplantation tolerance. And the experiment that's often cited is one in which somebody is unfortunate enough to lose their kidneys to a disease called multiple myeloma, in which the treatment for which can include a bone marrow transplant. And so if you do a bone marrow transplant to treat the myeloma and give them a kidney transplant from the same donor, a significant number of them no longer require immunosuppression. Now, could we be doing that with pig bone marrow as well as a pig organ? Could we generate at least partial tolerance? The answer is I don't know, but there's
And
a lot
would
of
the person become part pig?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, a lot of people have asked that question. How much pig do you? One thinks of Animal Farm, and the final scene where the pigs and the men ended up drinking together in the farmhouse, and nobody could tell quite who was the pig anymore and who was the man. And I've used that picture often enough in talks I've given. I think I'm less concerned by that, because I think the differences are very significant, and it's to do with as much brain function as anything else. But
well, thank you for your answer, and I'm happy to report that in the case in my family, tolerance was achieved, albeit not immediately. And just thank you so much for your work, which is saving so many lives.
Oh, thank you for your nice comments.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you. David Lawrence, I think you have a question you'd like to put.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Is there less survival time of the recipient the older the person who is donating, i.e. the organs will be older?
So I think that the short answer to that is operationally not really. What we try and do is we try and match the donor age and the recipient age to some extent. I wouldn't put a 75-year-old kidney into a 20-year-old recipient, because then, you know, if you're looking for that person to survive to 80, then you're looking for that kidney to be perfectly happy at 135, which is, you know, is a big ask. And similarly, I wouldn't put a 20-year-old kidney into a 75-year-old recipient. So we do try and match by age. And so it isn't really functionally a problem. And I haven't ever come across a situation where, because we do know that as we get older, that our kidneys become less and less effective and lose function. I've never come across a situation of a young patient whose kidney is just aged too rapidly.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Eva Lawrence, I think you have two questions you want to put.
I think you may be muted.
Can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you.
Yes.
Right.
This is a much more trivial transplant, but I had a tooth transplant, and they used, because my bones aren't all that good, they also put in some animal bone matter first. I mean, as far as I think you've answered my question, because if you eat meat, I presume the ethics of that are that, yes, but I wonder if other people have other opinions on that.
So the use of bone matter, first of all, it's likely to be acellular. So it's just going to be calcium phosphate and calcium apatite and essentially non-cellular material, which will not provoke an immune response. So what I suspect they will do is they'll take the bone out from the animal and they'll remove the cellular material first. So immunologically, it's not going to produce much of a challenge.
I have a question I would like to ask you. I mean, I'm sure because your area is that of you know, human transplantation. Of course, that took up the bulk of your presentation. But I'm just interested to know where the sort of focus of research largely is now. Is it with human transplantation, improving the efficacy of that? Is it with, you know, animal transplant and genetic modification, or is it with technological advances? Where are we going with this?
Well, it's the answer is all of the above. Things are moving simultaneously, and they're driven by the data that we have suggesting which is most likely to be effective. The problem with standard human transplantation now is we've been so successful, it's very difficult to demonstrate improvements, because if you've got an 80% 5-year survival, you need a very large number of transplants to get a statistically significant improvement, and you have to wait a very long time before you get the results of your study. So that's been we've been the victims of our success there. With respect to xenotransplantation, transplantation from animals, it's very expensive research to do. And when I did my research in that, I did it in Boston, and one of the very few places in the world that were actually set up to do that. You need large colonies of animals, and certainly if you're involving primates, there are a lot of people who are very anxious about the use of primates as appropriate organs. I didn't do any primate work myself, but it's technically difficult, it's morally challenging, and it's very expensive. I think probably, particularly with hearts, the focus is on technological mechanical solutions at the moment. It's a lot further off with kidneys and livers, but with hearts, we like to tease our cardiology colleagues that their organs are a pretty simple lump of meat that just pumps things around, and we've got the clever organs that do all the things that secrete hormones and manipulate chemistry. But because we've got these damn clever organs, then imitating what they do is that much harder. So the cardiologists are in a better place to do it than we are.
I see, thank you. Ian Lancaster, Ian, the chair of Jewish Renaissance, has a question.
Yes, thank you. I was fascinated by the statistics, the graphs that you showed. And so I wondered whether there is yet any statistical information on the difference between opt-out donor systems and opt-in donor systems, and indeed whether you would have a view on the halachic differentiation or approach to that differentiation.
So just in case anyone's not familiar with it, the assumption in law now in England, Wales, and Scotland, I think not yet in Northern Ireland, is that an individual, unless they had actively said that they do not wish to be a donor, the assumption is that they would wish to be a donor. And therefore, in the absence of any evidence to contrary, it is permissible to remove an organ for donation there. Previously, it was an opting-in system when one needed active consent, which was often sought, if it wasn't actually provided through the statement of the deceased person, it was sought through relatives. We have what's called a soft opt-out, and the reality is that in a situation where there was no actual view or no statement of opting out by the donor, if the family said, we don't want this and he wouldn't have wanted it, it's not going to happen that anyone is going to disregard that. And in fact, if you just say that I knew that the person didn't wish to do that, then that would be taken as a statement of opting out by the donor. But it's changed from the reason that it's a significant change is it means that society has taken the view that this is the position that should be the default one, and that is something that is discussed with the family, which is different to what would have been the case 10 years ago. But to come to your question, has it made a difference? Well, it's been law in England for too short a time, but it has been law in Wales since December 2015, which is now 6.5 years ago. And of course, there are relatively few donations in Wales, but after about 5 years, it became clear that the number of organs available in Wales had gone up significantly using standard statistical tests following the introduction of the opt-out law. So it seems to be that it has had an impact. Now, there's always the confusing factor about whether or not it's that law that has made the difference, or this has generated a change in mindset and generally people are more positive. And it's very interesting that in Israel, they introduced a rule that if you had agreed to one of your relatives being a donor, and then subsequently down the line, you yourself needed a transplant, you got more points on the transplant waiting list. And of course, the number of people to whom that applies is very small. However, the number of people then joining the waiting list went up very significantly. And the general view is what happened was there was just such public debate and discussion of it that people came to the view that actually, yes, this is the right thing to do. And so one has to always be careful to say, well, this is definitely due to the opt-out legislation. It might just be due to increased discussion and increased awareness. And that, of course, is the best situation, is where somebody has said to their family members, look, if it ever arises, I would like to be a donor, so that the individual caught in that awful situation of the imminent demise of a loved one, having to agonize about whether or not they're going to be agreed to donation, are able to say, well, we had talked about it. And I know that he or she would have wished to do it, and therefore I can honor their memory by doing so. And that avoids the awful situation I've come across twice before the law changed, but it could apply now, when somebody asked relatives to allow someone to be a donor, as I think it was after a road traffic accident. It was a terrible situation. And the common thing that some people say is, no, they've been through enough, I don't want them to have another operation. Absolutely not. And so the donation didn't happen. And then in these two cases, the following day, the parent of the deceased came back in and said, I've thought about it, and actually it's what they would have wanted. To which the answer has to be, I'm afraid it's too late now. So that, you want to avoid that. And the way to do that is to discuss it and make sure your loved ones are aware.
Patty, you have a question. Patty Collins? All right, there.
Sorry, I was muted. Good. Yes, no, I was just saying that this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. I mean, I've got a couple of questions about unintended consequences. One being, I mean, I don't know if there are statistics, but I know that sometimes a donor may become ill as a result of their donation, which is a very sad thing. So I just wondered if you had any statistics or anything to say about that. Yeah, go on.
It's actually pretty rare, actually. And there are large studies of outcomes of donors. And the initial couple of studies actually showed that the survival rate in donors was better than in age-matched population. Why is that? In which, if that's true, should we all be running out and giving away our kidneys? The answer is no. It's because the population of individuals who were screened and in whom any illnesses was detected, they would no longer be allowed to be donors. So actually the donating population was a very healthy population. So you would expect that population would do better than an age-matched general population. And it's very difficult to think of a control group for people who went through the screening process and didn't donate, because the numbers are quite small there. But it tells you that if there is an impact, it's a pretty small impact. There have been some suggestions. There was a big paper published about 10 years ago that there was a trivial instance in increased cardiac disease amongst donors, but that's not been reproduced in any other study. And there have been one or two other studies that have suggested that there's a slight increase, or I think it's probably true to say there's a slight increase in blood pressure, and there's a slight increase in release of protein in the urine. But the vast majority of people run into no problems, and they are followed for life. But every procedure has its adverse effects, and there have been very small numbers of occasions of people who have been donors and not survived. I know of one in Belfast. That's the only one I'm aware of that happened in the UK, and I know of one that had a major surgical complication. But these, this has been my field for 30, 40 years, and I've only ever heard of these two disasters. But there are two disasters too many. I accept that.
That's very reassuring. Thank you. That's very helpful.
I think at this point we're going to turn to Aviva. You have a question, I think, and then you're going to thank Anthony. But before I sign off here, I want to thank you personally for an absolutely fascinating, stimulating talk. Yes, I will follow the area and see the developments with great interest in future years. Thank you.
Excellent. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Sybil. And yeah, I'm taking kind of privilege of asking the last question, if that's all right, because we did set this up as a Jewish medical ethics session, although I note that a lot of the questions have been more possibly about the medical than the ethics, which is fascinating to us all. But in most cases, the answer seems to be pikuach nefesh, that life above everything. That's the very simple answer. And what you were showing is the reasoning, the pulling on precedents, and each time a new thing changes, how the rabbis change too, because Moshe Feinstein's response about heart donation is no longer, for example, what Chief Rabbi Mervis is doing. So I want to ask you about future developments. To what extent are you in the medical community speaking with the rabbis and engaging over all these possible future technologies? And are the medical community, as much as the rabbinic community, part of mapping out Jewish medical ethics for the future?
So I would say to a great extent, because many of these decisions, and indeed many issues in medicine generally, have got two components. They've got the technological piece about what can and can't be done and how we can move in that direction. And there's the social and ethical piece. And in the latter, about what is appropriate to do in our communities. And this latter is an area in which I don't believe that we as doctors have any greater insight than the other members of the community. And indeed, one has to be responsive to the heterogeneity of views that there is in the community about what is and what is not acceptable. So how are we moving forward on that? Well, every ethics committee in the country has got a non-medical, at least one non-medical lay person on them. And very often they are ministers of religion, but not always so. Sometimes they're academics or other people with an interest in ethics. And they have, it's not tokenism. It really is not tokenism. Their views are taken into account. And it would be a very brave ethics committee that overrode the view of its lay member. Every grant application for research has a lay component in it, in which things are summarized for the benefit of non-specialists. Every grant awarding body in deciding who is going to get money to do research will have non-specialist lay people on it. I served for, I think, 8 years on the Human Tissue Authority, which regulates organ donation in this country. Every living donor, every living donation in this country has to be given permission by the Human Tissue Authority. And we had a number of lay members on the authority. In fact, I think I was the only clinically qualified person at one point. We had, for example, the Bishop of Worcester, who was another member, a very interesting, fascinating, thoughtful person. And one of the things we were discussing was the ethics of uterine transplantation for infertile women. And at that stage, I was the chair of the transplant group within the Human Tissue Authority. We had a fascinating presentation, and that has now moved forward and is now regarded as ethically appropriate for a number of people. So I think we are taking serious account of the views of the community, but of course, you know, there isn't a view of the community. And one of the problems with expert patients or lay representatives is how do you find somebody to represent 65 million people? And the answer is you don't. And what you look to them is to have a centrist balancing position. there will always be people who will be upset. There are people who do not accept animal testing in medical research, and I respect that, but respectfully disagree. There are those who, we see in anti-vaxxing, there's people who are very suspicious of medical advances. And one of the things I learned from my own research was how alienated some people feel from the medical establishment. I mean, just briefly to talk about this, one of the pieces of research I did was to ask the question about how many people agree to organ donation, deceased donation, and there was a massive, absolutely massive ethnic bias here. Things have changed, but we're talking about 15 years ago. You would get something like a 60% agreement from the white community, and a 25% agreement from the Asian community, and a 10% agreement from the Black community. So this was in Tony Blair's time. So of course we set up focus groups, which is what we all did. And Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and it turned out that it wasn't people being difficult or non-rational. It reflected a degree of alienation from the establishment that made them fearful that they would be properly treated. So these are very important issues that need to be taken account of in moving forward in any medical developments. Wow, there was a long meandering discussion comment following on from a very simple question. Sorry, Aviva.
But perfect. And I think those kind of complex answers and thoughtful answers are exactly why we've been so delighted to have you with us this evening. I mean, just to say a huge thank you on behalf of all the audience from both Lions Learning and Jewish Renaissance. I mean, I've known Anthony for a long time, and Ruth, who is not quite in the picture, here she is, over 20 years. I've known him as a surgeon, a transplant surgeon. I've known him as a macher, whether it's through Limud or London School of Jewish Studies or the various synagogues or schools he's been chair of the boards for. But until tonight, I'd never seen him as an educator, although he's Dean of Education of, is it Queen Mary's, Barts, and now a medical school on Malta that is accredited through. So, clearly education is a huge part of what you do. But I've really seen tonight, as we all have, what makes you a fantastic educator as well as doctor, which is that forensic precision, but also the compassion and the thoughtfulness. So we really appreciate it. We appreciate even more you taking on the job of two people, as Graham was unable to join us. And I just want to say to everyone who's with us that we hope you've enjoyed it. Next week, we are going on from physical to mental health, but I think it's the same question really, and that is the relationship between individual and community, between patient and those who perhaps can support or give to them. So I hope you'll join us next week when we're going to look at the Jewish perspective on mental health with great panel. We've got Rabbi Howard Cooper, who is also a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. We have a psychiatrist, Louise Borgenstein, who is part of the board of JAMIE, the Jewish Association for the Mentally Ill. We have a patient advocate, David Gilbert, who himself has been treated by the NHS, but has represented patients as one of those lay experts Anthony's talked about for 35 years. And last but very much not least, we've got Dr. Susie Orbach, who is, as well as being a therapist herself, a social critic, a writer, and probably best known as the former therapist to Princess Diana. So I hope you'll join us for next week's panel on mental health. And just a huge, huge thank you again to Professor Anthony Wartons. If you want to unmute yourselves and give him a sounded round of applause, we'd love that. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.